Hi, everybody. My name is Derek, and today we're honored to have Diana Ahmad with us for our latest guest interview. She wrote the book Success Depends on the Animals, and it's kind of focused in on the time between 1840 and 1869, and you've got Americans and Europeans going westward. And the book is interesting because it takes the focus of what was the relationship between animals and the people who were going west. I'm going to bring in Diana here, and she's going to tell you a bit about how she got interested in history and specifically how she got interested in the American West and this topic of animals and the kind of relationships they had with people.
Hello. My name is Diana Ahmad, and I'm a professor at Missouri S&T, and I teach history of the American West. I became interested in history of the American West when I was in first grade. So I've always wanted to study the history of the West. I loved cowboys, I loved horses, all of those things. So I'm never a good person to ask, what do I want to be? You know, when somebody comes to me and they're a certain age and, well, what should I be? I can never tell them because I always wanted to be a professor of the American West. So I've always studied them, so it's okay. But now my animals are my new thing. Derek.
Nice. So I was wondering if you just give us an idea about what the Overland Trails were. What is the process of this journey westward?
The process of the journey was, I can only imagine, very complicated for the people who did it. First of all, they don't know where they're going, really. There are diaries that people have sent them home. So it might have been an uncle was out in California already, and they sent a diary home. They wrote letters. There were a handful of guidebooks that told you how to go west. But for the most part, you couldn't trust them because they didn't have any way to really count the number of miles. The people who are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, they had one of the best guidebooks to get you to at least Salt Lake City. And there they created a system where as the wheel was going around and around, it would tick off however many times the wheel went around, and they would be able to figure out how many miles they had gone. But basically, it was, turn right at the cactus, turn right at the Prairie Dog's house, turn left at the buffalo. But the buffalo and the prairie dog move locations occasionally. So they were pretty much kind of in a scary situation. Why did they go west? What motivated them to go west? Well, for some, pure unadulterated adventure. All right, I'm going west. Goodbye, honey. And off they left, and off they went. Many of them will come home. The majority did not. The majority stayed out west somewhere. People also went west. For those people who weren't into the adventuresome part of it, they did go west for the obvious, the gold, right? So you wanted to go and get rich. One thing to keep in mind for those of you who like the NFL, San Francisco has a football team called the San Francisco 49ers. Gold Rush. All right, that's where their name came from the gold rush. So for those of you who don't like the Green Bay Packers, you might like the San Francisco 49ers. Also, people may have gone west to get a farm because the land was available, especially on up in Oregon. And we've all know about the Oregon Trail. So when you left wherever home was, and home could have been in Europe, there's a large number of Europeans who came to the United States to go west. There are people from the American South, from Georgia and Alabama, lots of people from Missouri, because we're sort of southern Midwest, and obviously lots of people from the northern part of the United States, New England, Wisconsin, Michigan, any of those places. So they wanted to go, and those were the people who went. Now, they're not the first to go west. Obviously, Native Americans were the first to be in the West. But as far as the white people that are going, they went along the Oregon Trail, which for us starts in Missouri, right? So in many cases, sometimes we don't even know where the families are from because all we have are their diaries or maybe letters they wrote to somebody, and they may not say where they themselves are from. So the chances are good we're going to know what their jumping off town was. That's what they were called, jumping off towns. The two most famous, of course, would be Independence, Missouri, and St. Joseph or St. Joe, Missouri. I don't think anybody ever called it St. Joseph in their diaries or their letters. It was always St. Joe. And I think those of us in Missouri know it's St. Joe. So those are the places they jumped off from, and they went from there. In the early days, 1841, 42, it was difficult to go because you really didn't know where you're going. But later on, as the years go on, by the time you get to the end of the 40s, like 1849 for the gold rush, 50, 51, you can pretty much judge where you're going by looking at the trail ahead of you, because so many thousands of wagons and obviously horses and oxen and mules and the wheels on the wagon are going to create trails through the whole entire thing. In fact, if you go out to Reno, Nevada, just on the edge, just the other side of the University of Reno and the University of Nevada and Reno, you can still see the wagon trails. You can still see the wagon trails going up between. You can also see them in Kansas and a number of other places. There'll be all this corn being grown, and there's two little lines. It's the wagon wheels. So in time, you could just follow the people ahead of you, hoping they knew where they were going.
Awesome. Now, of course, to pull a wagon, you need to have horses. And in the book, your book, Success Depends on the Animals, one of the key themes here is, how is the relationship between animals and their human companions evolving? Now, a lot of these travelers, they believed that they knew what it took to have the animals. And once they got into some of these jumping off towns, they started training, and some of them found out that, well, maybe it's a little bit harder than we thought. How did the people who are in these jumping off towns, how did this relation start changing, even just from when we're starting at these jumping off towns?
Well, some of it starts, and this is something I think we often forget. We think that every single person who went west and every single person who was in the United States absolutely knew how to ride a horse. They knew what to do with an ox. They knew how to handle a mule. No, they didn't. All right. Because if you worked in a small factory in Boston, you had no clue how to ride a horse. Why? You may have seen a horse in Boston, but you might not have even touched one. So by the time they get out to Western Missouri, what happens there is they have to figure out how to ride the horses, how to get on a horse. And I know that sounds like super basic, but they didn't always know. So they had to learn. And how do you learn? It's frankly often the same way we learn, trial and error. And there are a number of people who wrote in their diaries that they were getting ready to the point where they wanted to punch the mule or punch the horse. And the ones who wrote about it, you can hear them laughing in the background. They don't actually do any of those things, but they're tempted. So it was a lot of trial and error. And as they became accustomed to one another, the horse or the mule, or, well, they're not going to ride the ox, but the horse or the mule, they would kind of look at each other. And a lot of times, it's so funny in the diaries, you would read it's mostly men who go west, but sometimes women have diaries as well. They would write in there going, "He looked at me and just shook his head," meaning the horse or the mule is shaking their head going, "This human is trying to ride me. Seriously." And they would sometimes be very patient. And eventually they kind of reached a happy point, I guess we could say. They reached a happy point about how they were going to handle everything and how it was all going. So I can only imagine what the people who were there were just laughing themselves sick. The people who were in St. Louis and in St. Joe and in Independence. But they also did something practical. Because Independence, Missouri was so important to the Santa Fe Trail, you had a lot of Mexicans who had come from obviously Mexico and now what we call the American Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico, places like that. They could actually be hired by the future overlanders, is what we call them. So the people going west, the emigrants, E-M-I-grants. All right. So they would hire the Mexicans to teach them how to ride the horse, how to saddle the horse, how to ride a mule, which mule was the best one to pick out of the corral if there was more than one. And the Mexicans apparently were very patient souls, and they taught the people going west how to do that. And again, in the diaries, there's so many compliments to the Mexican trainers. And they said that the men would often roll their eyes, just like the mules and the horses did. But everybody got paid and everybody got taught. So that's all that mattered.
Fantastic. Now when we talk about the let's see, let me kind of reorient because you just went into some good things. I kind of want to pull back for a moment. But so before they're going to these turning off point towns, Independence and St. Joe, they are meeting or they're coming with a certain set of expectations, and religion is playing a role in this. In terms of how you treat animals and from a religious standpoint, how you treat animals in terms of American intellect, like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Paine. They actually covered it a bit. I'm wondering if you can kind of give us an idea about how people are approaching animals before they even start this journey. How are they approaching animals in terms of their mindsets?
Okay, good questions. Let's go to the philosopher first, because then we can do the schooling, the religious part. But the philosophy part, and I actually have this written down so I don't mess up the poem. Benjamin Franklin wrote something. It says, "For want of a nail, a shoe was lost. For want of a shoe, a horse was lost. For want of a horse, the rider was lost." And this is written, it's published in 1732 and 1757. So you're looking at what, almost 100 years before they go west on the Oregon Trail and the California Trail. And that is almost something, if they did tattooing of poems on arms back then, that would have been a good one. All right, that would have been a good one because it's telling you you have to take care of your animals. You cannot make it west without your animals. Were there people who walked west? Yes, but not by choice. Some of those ended up walking west because they really had no choice because their animals had died or were killed by a wolf or fell off a cliff, things like that. So that was in there. So Ben Franklin had been teaching people about that for years now. Thomas Paine, who of course is one of the important people in the American Revolution, he wrote a book called, or a pamphlet called Common Sense. He said that we should not be cruel to animals. All right, we should not be cruel because it violates the human moral duty. So that was in there. But then you throw in religion into this, besides the philosophy. You throw in religion. And starting in the 1800s, so the early 1800s, like around the War of 1812, 1820, you start to get Catholic and Protestant, of all the varieties of Protestants. So the varieties of Protestants, Catholics, and then a little bit later, the members of the LDS, right, the Latter-day Saints, they come in there. And what they want you to do is they want you to treat the animals as if they are just as important to God as everybody else. All right, everybody else. Now, they also believed, even as things are changing, that animals are inferior to humans because they may or may not have a soul. It depends on which religion and sect that a person belongs to. But they said God wants you to treat his creatures with respect, with kindness, because God put those creatures on earth to serve us. So just because they might not be in heaven, potentially later on, doesn't mean they shouldn't be treated well. You can't just go up to a horse and, smack him. You have to be nice to the horse. You have to feed them. You have to shoe them. You have to make sure their grass is fresh and their water is good, that it's not, doesn't have any alkali in it later on, for instance. So you had to do all of those things. And it might be going into another question, but what it leads to then is how the Americans are starting to go into, excuse me, something called Victorianism. It's a British word, but we have our own variety of American Victorianism, the age of sentimentality. And in order to prove that you are civilized, and that's the word that's used back then, it's not a word, it's not just a word I'm using, it was a word used back in the 1830s and so forth. In order to be a civilized person have a civilized American society, we must know how to treat the animals. Obviously treat people too, but today we're talking about animals. So cruelty is a sign of antisocial behavior. So if we have antisocial behavior, then we're not a civilized society. Nothing is going to be good. Who'd want to come to the United States if we're not civilized? So animals and children actually sometimes fall into the same category. We need to treat the animals and the children as sweet, innocent creatures, both human creature and animal creature, four-legged creatures, and we have to treat them with goodness. We have to be so kind to them, and because they don't know better. We know a little kid that's 3 or 4 years old. They go, "Oh, cute! Look at the snake!" "Oh, cute! Look at the prairie dog!" And they need to be taught what they can or cannot do. So, with all of it, it falls into that kind of that kind of category.
Nice. And I want to just give a shout out. Teresa Davidson wrote, "Cool, never knew that." So awesome. Somewhere in there, you educate somebody on something new. And I want to just thank you, Teresa, for being here. Thank you for commenting. We have several people that are now joining on. I would like to just remind you that we are doing questions. So if you have any questions or comments, go ahead and pop them in the chat, and we will get to them later. If you just do them at any time, and then we'll fit them in as time goes on. And then also comments, of course, are very welcome. If you want to say where you're from and say hi to Diana, you can do that too. I know we have some other people, not just from here in Rolla or Missouri. I know there's some other people in the States elsewhere. So go ahead and write down where you're from if you want. So Diana, what is a challenge or what's one of the most significant challenges that came up as you had these different immigrants preparing their animals for this travel westward?
The hardest thing to do is pretty much what we've already covered in that sense. We had to figure out how to ride them. We had to figure out what to pack. And this is interesting for us because when we go to the airport, our suitcases are so thin and, they don't weigh much of anything, but they had trunks that were made out of 2x4s. So can you imagine a trunk that's like 3 feet from, left to right? And then it's maybe about 18, 24 inches deep and then 2-3 feet high, all made out of 2x4s. That weighs a ton, right? Relative to what's there. And that means the more you put in that trunk, the heavier it's going to be for the horses, oxen, and mules who are going to pull it. So a lot of times, and I think this is one of the things that they learn very, very early. And I think it's also one thing, if you're old enough, if there's anybody out there old enough, or if you watch the reruns of the TV show called Wagon Train, all right, the Wagon Train TV show always showed the husband and the wife sitting on the front seat, having their horses go forward. And they had their children in the back. No, it was one person that was in charge of the wagon. One person sat there and made sure the animals went forward. So it could be the husband for a while, it could be the wife for the while, and depending on the age of the children, it could even be the children. And obviously, as the 2 to 3 months it takes to go out west gets along, even the younger kids can learn how to drive the wagons. So, because if a mother and a father, for instance, if they're on the front seat, the wife might weigh 120, 130 pounds, something like that. The husband might weigh 160, 170 pounds, give or take a little bit, obviously. So you have to get rid of one of them. So they had to learn how much the animal could handle, right? How much can the animal handle so that they knew, what they were doing and cause no damage to the animals. Because if you overtax them, they're going to die. And it does come to the point where some people did learn the hard way. They didn't feed their animals correctly. They didn't water them wherever they could stop. They didn't rest them enough, which, by the way, with the religion, one of the things ministers taught them was to make sure they rested on the Sabbath. And I'm sure for those of you who do go to church, you often hear rest on the Sabbath, right? So by resting on the Sabbath, that meant the animals needed to rest too. And not just for the love of God, but the love of your animals. God wanted you to rest the animals so they they could chill out, for that 24 hours that they were in the middle of nowhere and all of the rest. Mr. Z?
Nice. So we got these, that's part of the challenges. Now, as they're starting to go westward, we have these, how long are we talking about in terms of a journey? Let's, put us into that kind of the shoes of these types of people. They're leaving St. Joe or they're leaving Independence. What kind of journey are they, in terms of length, are they expecting?
It's roughly 2,000 miles. All right. Now, keep in mind, if we were to fly from St. Louis to San Francisco, it's 4 hours, right? In a regular airplane, not a fancy one, but just a regular American Airlines or Delta. It's about 4 hours. For them, that same journey from St. Louis to San Francisco is 2 to 3 months. All right, 2 to 3 months. There are journeys that last as long as 5 months. And that one probably meant they had some troubles along the way. Could be with animals, could be with sickness. There was cholera, for instance, for a while in parts of it. They went the wrong way and had to figure it out. But it took them 2 to 3 months because they're only traveling anywhere between 5 and 25 miles a day. So it's not very far. 5 miles, you can walk it today if we've got our Nikes on and all that. We can do 5 miles in an hour if we, a little bit practiced at it. So we can do that in no time. But remember, the horses, the oxen, and the mules are carting all of this stuff, and you have to rest them. So if you find grass, you have to wait because you want them to eat. Because you turn around and you can see thousands of people behind you every year. And so the best time to leave would be around April Fool's Day, which is sort of a bad time to think of it. But around if you left in mid to late March, it was a little bit early because you're still going to run into some of the snowstorms that are on the Great Plains and obviously as you approach the Rocky Mountain or the Sierra Nevada. So you could run into that. So that can cause problems, like for the Donner Party, right, where they had to resort to eating one another. All right, so that's just outside of Reno. That's the only time that we know of that happening, we can hope. But 2 to 4 months was on average, 2 to 3 if you kind of figure things out as you're going along very well. But it took a long time. But the I'm probably going someplace too far. But anyway, the hardships they encountered on the journey would be some of the things that stopped you. And some of the things that stopped you would be people getting sick. People had babies too. All right. Women went west when they were with child, shall we say. So they were pregnant and they went west. They gave birth in the middle of the Great Plains. So they knew full well they were pregnant when they left. How much time did they wait so the wife could relax and recover some strength? And the baby might be, not such a 1 day old. Sometimes they went after 2 days or 3 days. Now, in that case, the husband was nice, obviously, and the mother and the baby would lay in the back of the wagon. Not on the front seat, but she would often get to lay in the wagon. With it was there. And some people got married on the wagons during the wagon trails. They met somebody and they got married. And they were pregnant before the wagon trains got to California or to Oregon. So things happened. All right, things happened, but they tried. But that was a difficult entity. So ultimately, in the long run, there will be people who are going to die on the Oregon Trail. There's no doubt. Precisely how many passed away, we can't say, because not everybody kept a diary, and some of the people would count the animals they saw that were dead. There's a number of them. This fellow by the name of McDarmid, he would write down every animal he saw. He kept like a little tick sheet. Oh, there's 2 oxen, tick, tick. There's a mule, tick. 3 horses, tick, tick, tick. He kept track. But remember, he can only mark down the animals he saw that he saw. If somebody was a mile on another way from him, to the left or to the right of him, he didn't see those animals. So, but the death was, in terms of humanity, in terms of human deaths, roughly about 750 people will die on the California Trail. And so you take the Oregon Trail from Missouri, And pretty much there's a number of ways that you can break off it, but you go roughly, the part I think most people know what I'm talking about is Salt Lake City. So you could go southwest to from Salt Lake City to California. That is basically the California Trail. Or you could go from Salt Lake City up to Oregon, which is the rest of the Oregon Trail. On that trail, on the Oregon Trail, there were about 25,000 to 30,000 people who died. And like I said, so about 750 to 1,000 on the California Trail, 25 to 30,000 on the Oregon Trail. Which leads us to the other question, because our talk is about animals. How many animals died on the Oregon and California trails? The numbers, and again, like this Mr. McDermott, he kept track of all of them, humans and animals alike. And the several others did as well. Some of them actually in their diaries comment on they can't continue. It's too sad. They can't continue writing down how many animals died. But to give you an idea, for those who took the California Trail, going across the part that is Interstate 80. So if anybody has been near Reno, there's actually a historic marker on one side, and you can see what they had to cross. They had to cross what's known as the 40-mile desert. They compared it to Golgotha in the Bible, and all kinds of names, purgatory, all of the names we get from the Bible. And it's all there. So going with the animals, to bring us back to the animals in this 40-mile trail, they estimated in people's diaries that if you gathered up all the animals that died on the 40-mile trail or the 40-mile desert and put them head to tail next to each other, you would never have to walk on the desert itself. You could walk the entire 40 miles on top of the animals and never touch the sands of the Humboldt Sink, it's called. All right, the Humboldt Sink or the 40-mile desert, either way, either name is perfectly acceptable. So it's pretty scary stuff.
So this wasn't just like a vacation here we're talking about. This was, a lot of people, and then they tend to get like the idea from, I don't know, like Rawhide or something that, just a couple of fun guys hanging out, they're cooking out. This was serious stuff. And you kind of get with the myth too, because the myth will play it up. But this was very hard to do, and it was a lot more dangerous sometimes than you might get the idea of. So that's fascinating about the amount of people who perished along these things. Now, something you kind of mentioned too, which is kind of interesting, is that kind of life went on too as you're traveling for months. Life goes on, so you're getting married, and there's people, they're having babies. Can you tell us what was kind of like the routine of a wagon trail life? What is your daily life like?
Your daily life, I can't even imagine. They would get up about 4 o'clock in the morning. Those people who actually wrote it in their diary. So based on that, they woke up about 4 o'clock in the morning. And one of the first things they did, if you were in an all-male wagon train, or if you had your wife with you, or there were other women, they would start a small fire. And so you can have coffee. So that's pretty traditional. A lot of people wake up and have their cup of coffee. So they would wake up and have their coffee and then something to eat. Most of the time what they ate was, it was a lot of beef jerky, because if you killed a buffalo, for instance, or if you had some meat that you brought with you from home, but if you killed a fresh buffalo, or buffalo who you got lucky and killed him, you could actually take all of his meat. You'd take the hide off, obviously, and then you would take the meat and put it inside the wagon. Because the wagon, you're holding up the covered wagon, right? You're holding up the covered part of it, the canvas part. And you would take the strips of buffalo meat or antelope meat, and you would hook it on the wooden things that were holding up the canvas. And by the time you settled down, so you killed the animal on a Tuesday, by the time you traveled overnight, Tuesday night and into Wednesday, the meat would actually be dry enough where you could store it and eat it. They ate virtually nothing fresh unless they were really lucky, because a buffalo is roughly 2,000 pounds. So you're going to have a nice steak that night. There's no doubt about that. You're going to have a good steak that night. But in terms of the rest of it, it's all going to become dried meat. Eggs, honestly, I don't think I've ever read anybody who ate any eggs. It was there. Prairie dogs, they did capture some prairie dogs, and sad to say, as they are my favorite, but prairie dogs taste like chicken. So tell me what doesn't taste like chicken as you go west. But prairie dogs supposedly were very good and tasted just like chicken. Although some people couldn't eat a prairie dog because they just thought they were so cute. So, but anyway, but when you're hungry, you're going to eat what you have. Sometimes people did give the grasses and things to their animals. If they only had a limited amount of water available in their canteen or in the buckets that they carried, they actually gave it to the animals. Because if the animal dies, you're not far behind. Here you might be in the desert or on the plains or in the mountains, and there's nothing to eat, there's nothing to drink. So it's better that you give it to the animals, even if it's a cup of water. It's better than nothing.
Nice. And I just want to remind everybody for some of the new folks that have joined on, we're talking about Success Depends on the Animals by Diana Ahmad. She's graciously decided to do a little interview with us. So if you have any questions, feel free to pop those down in the chat. We will get to those towards the end, but you can go ahead and ask those at any time. Or if you have any comments as well, make them nice. Otherwise, they'll have to be filtered out by me. You won't get public broadcasting through that. You'll have to go through me. So the worst that'll happen is I'm going to be a filter. But no, if you have any good comments or anything, go ahead, pop them in there, or any questions whatsoever, go ahead and put those in. Diana, you mentioned that prairie dogs were your favorite. Could you tell us why that is?
Well, first of all, prairie dogs are really cute. And the closest prairie dog I can think of that I know of here is at the St. Louis Zoo. So by all means, go make your reservations and go to the St. Louis Zoo. My prairie dog buddies are above my head on my bookshelf. So there's a couple of and one does come from the St. Louis Zoo, by the way. Well, there he is. He's over above my whatever shoulder this one. It's backwards on here, but you can see. But the prairie dogs are there. Prairie dogs are just really cool. They never bothered anybody. They weren't harmful. They didn't hurt you. And they would also seem like they were actually very much like humans. A lot of the people who commented on the prairie dogs, the ones who commented on the prairie dogs, they equated their society to be just like human society, just like American society. They considered them to have a sophisticated enough society where they had a military and a government set up. They believed that they had villages or towns, and that's how they referred to it. They went through the prairie dog village. They went to the prairie dog town. They didn't just say, well, this is where the prairie dogs lived. So they're starting. I agree, Teresa. Thank you. And the prairie dogs, what they had is they had villages, cities, and towns, and underneath the earth, they actually had highways and byways that people used. And the people that were on the Overland Trails, they would stop and watch them. And the prairie dogs actually had, I call them a boss, but they had a better word. They called them a burger, not the kind you eat, but a kind like the Germans would use, right? So people who were in charge, like a mayor. All right. So they had mayors there. The people who were the more experienced, thank you, Terry. The people who were the more experienced burgers are the ones who gave out a certain chirping noise. And that left all of the people to know it was safe to come. Or depending on the tone of voice or his chirping, it would depend on maybe you needed to go back into your subterranean condominium is what I refer to them as. So go back into the condominium. And prairie dogs also will share their prairie dog condominiums with just about anybody. All right. In fact, they even shared it with rattlesnakes and owls and rabbits or hares. All right. So hares and rabbits are different, but in any case, you get what I mean. So they were in there. Now, snakes did like to eat prairie dog babies. And what they would do is the adult prairie dogs would nip at the snake to either get the snake to go away or potentially to even kill the snake. If they did kill the snake, the prairie dogs would actually bury the snake in a condominium that they didn't use anymore. They would stuff them into an abandoned condo, and that's where he went. Prairie dogs, though, were very careful. They had one of my favorite expressions from the Overlanders is they said that prairie dogs had a saucy bark. There's a word we don't use anymore. It's a saucy bark. All right, so the prairie dogs use that, and they had them in these kinds of situations. They also found the humans, the Americans and the others going west, they said that the prairie dogs would expand their borders if necessary. They would expand their borders. Well, think about it. Were the Americans expanding their borders at this time? Remember, when people went west in 1840, 41, 42, all the way until 1848, the Americans did not own California. They did not own Nevada or Utah, Arizona, New Mexico. They didn't own those areas. Mexico owned those areas. So there was a war between the United States and Mexico in 1846 that lasted for 2 years. One of the results of what we call the Mexican-American War, that the United States pretty much gets the border. So they get us into the area, so it's there. And anyway, there was a message that came across. Sorry, it just threw me a little bit. All right, but in any case, the Americans were thinking about the Mexicans that needed to expand, and we fought them so that we could expand ourselves, so that we could expand and all of that. There was that. So you have that. So the concept of manifest destiny, if you will, seeking out new life and new civilizations, to borrow from Captain Kirk. All right. So it fits. So when I listen to Star Trek, it's similar to what the believers that were going west and the Prairie Dogs were there. They formed these communities and everything else. So they were pretty good. And they don't hurt you. Prairie Dogs don't hurt you. And if you've ever played whack-a-mole, that's how people would also describe prairie dogs. They would pop up out of their holes and you would try to shoot them. But some people said prairie dogs could actually dodge bullets, as they believed that Americans could dodge bullets, like we had in what they said is the Mexican-American War. And they're cute.
They are. And we have lots of great comments coming in. Thanks, everybody, for their participation. Thank you, Teresa, for your comments. Joshua says, "Hi, Dr. Ahmad. I can't stay on, but I just wanted to say hi."
Hi, Joshua.
Thanks, Josh, for popping in. Good comments. We have a comment here. Let's see. Oh, it's not wanting to work for me. Oh, wrong one. There we go. The Omaha Henry Dorley Zoo has a prairie dog exhibit that the prairie dogs keep digging out of and running around to other parts of the zoo.
Oh, my gosh. Usually zoos have a cement enclosure, so they can dig down, but there's usually a cement or equivalent underneath. So obviously Omaha needs to fix their zoo.
Funny stuff. Teresa asks, were there plague outbreaks in the prairie dog populations back then?
Not noted. It wasn't noted in the diaries. I think it comes later. I don't think it comes right now. At this time, no one talked about anything about being bit by a prairie dog. To be honest, I've never read in the diaries anybody who was ever attacked by a prairie dog at all. So as far as the plague outbreaks, which of course will happen, so please don't touch prairie dogs now. If you see prairie dogs in the wild, don't go up and pet them. All right, don't do that. All right, chances are good they don't have the plague, but you know, we know what the plague is like now, so let's not do it. All right, so just leave the wild guys alone, kind of like squirrels. Just leave them alone, or rabbits. Just let them be, let them do their own thing.
Awesome. You mentioned Star Trek. I kind of have to, for a follow-up, you mentioned Star Trek, and of course the big thing is it's the final frontier, right? And I'm kind of curious with your discussion of prairie dogs. These prairie dogs are almost like this metaphor for what the kind of society that they are wanting to put together. Honestly, Star Trek is really in many ways, if you watch it, a metaphor for the kind of society that they're envisioning. This diverse group of people, yes, and they're trying to civilize these savage planets and whatnot. How do humans see themselves in the kind of wildlife that they're interacting with?
Superior, that humans are superior. The only ones that they felt almost equivalent to would be the prairie dogs. All right, because like I said, they use normal words, streets, alleys, villages, cities, towns. They use words. Oh, and one gentleman actually said that prairie dogs, male prairie dogs, gave female prairie dogs the right to vote. All right, they gave them the right to vote. And keep in mind, they're going to Oregon. And of course, Oregon is going to give women the right to vote earlier than many other states. All right, so there you can have women can have the right to vote before you became a state back in the old days. And they said that female prairie dogs had the right to vote. So they were actually, I suppose the word would be liberal. All right, so they were very liberal little guys. They're about a foot and a half or so. All right, so they were very liberal little guys, and they enjoyed what they were doing because they knew they were right. And they would always bark or have that sussy bark at all of the wagon trains that were coming through. And then later they have paintings of the trains, the iron horse kind of trains going through with prairie dog villages right there. So the train tracks, the Union Pacific would be going through, and the prairie dogs would be popping up and barking at the trains because they've invaded the dignity. That's the words that was used in the diary. They've invaded the dignity of the prairie dog village. It was there. But prairie dogs, too, this is a fun story. There was a young man. He's from Missouri. His name was William Curitan. William Curitan is from Missouri, and his parents didn't want him to live with them anymore. So the cousin was going to go to California. So the parents told William, you go with your cousin, get out. We don't want you anymore. He wrote his reminiscence. And in any case, so he goes west, and he loved the prairie dogs because, like I said, they lived with owls and snakes and everything. And they were apparently more tolerant of bad behavior than his family was. So he loved prairie dogs. And he and his family, he was 14 years old when he went west. His cousin, by the way, kicked him out of the wagon train 3 times. Other people took him in, fortunately, but he did make it to California, did marry, and did live happily ever after.
Boy, can you imagine getting kicked off a wagon train? You're already in the middle of nowhere, and then you get kicked out into the middle of nowhere even more.
Yeah, and not everybody's going to pick you up, right? The wagon behind you might not, because if they have 5 people in their wagon group, right, the one wagon, they'd have food for 3 people. They can't all of a sudden become 6 people, right? So it would have to be somebody very kind-hearted. But he did get lucky. He managed to find other wagons that would adopt him for a short time.
Wow. And you mentioned, that kind of leads to another point. You mentioned about animals, and there was, of course, a lot of animals died on this journey. Could you put that into, of course, a lot of the animals, and as we find out, a lot of the animals, they had very almost like a friendship relationship, but there's also the utilitarian benefit of animals, what they're doing for the people in terms of transportation, in terms of food and whatnot. What is how does success depends on the animals? How is the success of the journey directly related to the animals? And so why is it important that they are taking care of these animals?
Well, the only way you're going to get to California or to Oregon, or if you're Mormon, to get out to Salt Lake, is to have the animals. Now, could you walk west without the animals? Yes, but remember, where's all your food going to fit? Many of us have had a backpack at some time. We've traveled, or you go to school with heavy books and so forth. So you could have that, but you're going to walk from Independence, Missouri, or St. Joe, Missouri, and you're going to walk to California. That's 2,000 miles. There's no Super 8 hotel. There's no McDonald's. So it's going to be virtually impossible. You also keep in mind, you say, well, maybe I can shoot antelope. Just take my rifle and shoot an antelope. Or I can kill a snake and eat the snake. I can do all of this. But there's one thing to keep in mind. A vast majority of the people who are on the Oregon Trail did not have a weapon. Many of them started with a weapon. All right. So in the 1840s and early 1850s, there are no replaceable parts yet. All right. So that doesn't come till the end of the 19th century. So with it, you have some idea. If you knew how to fix a rifle, you could do it. But if there was a stampede, let's say some buffalo came by and your oxen decided to join the buffalo herd, which does happen, by the way, and all of a sudden your wagon goes wild and crazy, and you happen to be holding your rifle, and the rifle gets tossed out onto the Great Plains or down a creek bed or wherever it may be, you can't replace it. So the chances of you walking west successfully without the animals, there's a slim chance you could do it. On the other hand, there are people who did use their wagons and horses, oxen, whatever they had, and the horses, oxen, mules died. So you would have to pack west from that point. Some people also said it's easier to travel with only one horse, one mule, or one ox. So they would sell off their other animals and they would pack the one animal and lead the horse. So you wouldn't get on the horse, but you're walking. So you and the horses, horse, oxen, whichever you're taking, you are going west during all of this entire time. So it becomes a real challenge. So how did you get to California? How did you get to Salt Lake? How did you get to Utah or Oregon, California, and Utah? Sorry. As you're getting out to all of these areas, your life depends on those animals. If I'm a doctor, a medical doctor, my tools are in the back. I can't pack my medical tools on one side of my shoulder and my food and trinkets on the other side of the shoulders, right? It's not possible. So with this, you did it if you absolutely had to and you tried. How many of them made it? We can't say for sure. But the majority will end up with at least one of the animals. Not all the animals made it from Missouri to California or Oregon. They didn't all. So sometimes when one died, you might find one that got abandoned. Because the humans, they sometimes felt so sad they would leave an animal behind. All right, were just worn out. They would literally collapse as they're walking along. So the humans or the immigrants, they would unhitch the ox or the mule, whatever it is, and they would abandon them. And the animals knew they were being abandoned because they'd be laying down on the, on the desert or on the Great Plains, and they would moo, kind of give us some kind of acknowledgement. The animals that were going forward actually turned around and made neighing sounds back or mooing sounds back. It was as if they knew. Now, some people, there was a big debate. Should you or should you not kill the animal you're going to abandon? If you had a rifle, a lot of the people said, yes, we should shoot him. Shoot the ox because he's not going to recover. And there's no water nearby, no grasses nearby. He's going to be a very slow, painful death, especially when the wolves come to finish him off. So sometimes they would shoot him. On the other hand, other humans said, no, we can't. We can't. He might recover. The wagons behind us might have some water, and in 3 days, he might feel good enough to travel. There was actually a young girl. She was about 14 years old. She loved her ox. She absolutely loved her ox, but he couldn't travel anymore. So they abandoned him. And when they abandoned him, she actually took out a piece of paper with a pen, sorry, not a pen, a pencil, and wrote on it the ox's name and said, please be kind to this animal. He's given us everything he's got. If you find him, be gentle. Did they ever go back for their animals? Excuse me. Absolutely, they went back for their animals. And now keep in mind, if you've abandoned your animal at point A and you've gone 10 miles and you go, oh my gosh, I need my animal back, I feel guilty. You have to take the other animals and go back 10 miles. Those animals have just done 20 miles. And the 2 or 3 days that you might wait, then all of a sudden it's like, wow, we've got to do these same 10 miles again. So the abandoned animal that's now recruited or rested, all right, so that animal's only gone that route once, 1 10-mile set. The others have done it 30 times. That's equivalent to 3 days' journey. So by changing your mind, you're costing the animals that had to go back to get the abandoned one a lot of time, a lot of mileage, shall we say.
Fantastic. We got some great questions coming in. Dev asks, besides the pack animals, what other critters were noted in diaries? Were there chickens, dairy cows, dogs?
Honestly, I've never seen chickens noted. Not the chickens we're thinking of. You know, not the kind like we eat at, I don't know, a Chick-fil-A, not that kind of chicken. I've never seen them noted. Dairy cows, they do kind of just clump them as calling them cows. So you don't know what kind of cow they are. Were they dairy cows or not? Dogs. There are dogs all over the place. All right. People would bring their dogs with them from wherever they were from. And the dogs, I don't know why, but it seems like all the diaries I read, I ran into like 3 different names for dogs. And the most common one was Trey. T-R-E-Y, Trey. He was the most common. And there's a really good story about Trey the dog. It's kind of sad, but it's a good story. Trey the dog came with his family from the East Coast. They were from like someplace like Indiana or Ohio. And they left in Independence, Missouri, and they're going to go. Well, the father has to make sure that his family has gotten across the river, his animals have gotten across the river, and everybody's there. So he's not going to worry about the dog. The dog cannot travel in the wagon because dogs weigh what, 40, 50, 60 pounds? That's too much extra for the animals to pull west. So in any case, they get across the river and they go another 10 miles or so. And they looked around at night after they had made camp. And they went, where's Trey the dog? We can't find Trey. The father and son got back on their horses, went back 10 miles to the Missouri River, looked all over the area, couldn't find Trey the dog. So they turned back around and go back 10 miles to the campsite. And they got to the campsite around 2 o'clock in the morning. They went, well, Trey the dog is missing. He went the wrong way. We don't know what happened to him. So the next day they pack their things and they go another 10 miles. They only went 10 miles because they had spent so much time going back and forth the night before that the animals and the family were very exhausted. Well, the second morning after they had made camp, the wagon train that came after them caught up with them, and there was Trey the dog. The man who was leading the wagon had actually recognized Trey, put Trey in the wagon so he wouldn't run away. And as soon as Trey saw his real owner, his real companion, he jumped off the wagon and ran towards the father. And in that evening, the dog Trey went from human to human, licking all their hands, not their faces, but their hands. The Trey went wild and crazy. So anyway, every day the father talks about Trey. Trey did this, Trey did that, does all the way until Oregon. They get out to Oregon. They have 1 day left on their journey to the Oregon country where they can call it quits. Some earlier family member had staked out some property for them, so they knew where they were going. Excuse me. In any case, Trey, sadly, on the last camping night, Trey finds some water to drink because animals, dogs and cats and so forth, were on their own as far as feeding themselves. Excuse me. Anyway, Trey found some water and he drank it. Sadly, what Trey didn't realize until too late is that it was filled with alkali. It was alkali water. So what happened is Trey died during the night. And I remember when I was at the Oregon Historical Society and I read this guy's diary, I remember going, oh, every historian in the archives turned around and said, what happened? I said, Trey died. And they all went, oh. Keep in mind, these are historians. We all knew what we were talking about. And Trey's been dead for 150 years. But I had spent so much time reading about Trey this, Trey that I felt like I knew Trey. There's also another story. There was a young couple, a young man and woman. They were in their early 20s. They were going on the California Trail. So they were going into California. And in any case, I'm reading the man's diary. I don't know he has a wife. All right, I'm reading the man's diary. He tells me what his dog did every minute of the journey. Every minute of the journey, sorry. He tells me what the dog did. The dog caught this. The dog caught that. The dog barked. You know, I didn't know he had a wife until the night before he got to California. It was like he didn't care about her. He wrote about his dog the entire trip. That dog made it to California.
Awesome. I wonder if you could draw a comparison between a pet owner of today and like the pet owners of back then. What are some of the things that are similar?
Well, if we could zap ourselves back in a time zone, I think the Oregon Trail and the California Trail people would think we're treating our animals like a bunch of sissies. All right. They let them go. Hey, Trey, you want to come? Let's go. And they went. Cats, too, were left to fend for themselves. So they didn't treat them the same way we do. Now you have people buying, like if you carry a baby, sometimes you can carry a baby on your chest. There's a little contraption you can hold a baby in, right? Or a backpack. Now we've got them for dogs. Or you can carry a purse. That's a dog holder, right? All of these things. They didn't have that at all. It's just like way over. But the other thing to remember is the breeds of dogs they had back in the old days don't exist now. There's only a handful of them that exist now. I mean, these little, I call them advanced cats, although they're cute and so forth. And please, if you like cats, cats are okay, but it's like the little poofy dogs that are, have to have a bath every day and you have to give them little nibbles cut in a certain way. That's not going to work. All right. So the cats and the dogs that went west were studly cats and dogs that went west. So we would be considered treating them. We treat our animals. I love it. Don't get me wrong. We need to buy the bed and the toys and the snacks. Absolutely. But our animals wouldn't have made it to California. Right. So for those of you planning to go west, get a car, all right, with a good engine and it'll be okay.
I often wondered if I would make it out west, loan enough some of my animals.
I can tell you how to do it. I can tell you how to go west.
The journey is still going to be tough, though.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
I see some questions. Diana, we actually have about 5 minutes till the hour. Are you good if we stay in our 10 minutes? Or
sure.
Fantastic. We'll kind of go to this question and we'll start wrapping up. Shirley asks, how long did they have to go between water sources?
Wow, that's a good question. Sometimes you run into a water source 3-4 times a day. All right. Sometimes it was constant, especially in the eastern areas. So when you're following the Platte River, for instance, going through Kansas, Nebraska, and things like that. Other times it may take a week before water sources, like on the in the Humboldt Sink area. All right, the Humboldt Sink, that 40-mile desert area I mentioned before. So it could be a very, very short time, and it could be a very long time. And the problem you ran into is just because it's a water source didn't mean it was safe. All right, it could have alkali in it. And if you drank alkali, you're going to get desperately ill. And especially the animals were going to get very, very sick. So, in fact, they might not even make it. They may just collapse in their as they're pulling the wagon in their harness. All right, so the water sources vary day to day. And remember, if you were smart, if I would go west, I would go west early. I would go about April 1st, not earlier than that, because I mentioned before about these snowstorms and so forth. But I'd go about April 1st, because you'd be one of the first wagon trains that was going to go through. So the water would not all be used up. But if you left by like April 30th, you're going to have some major water issues. First of all, there's not going to be much grass either, because all of the wagon trains before you would have gone west before, and they would have eaten up all the grasses, which means the people who left in late April, early May, and some people do leave in May, they're going to have major issues. So we can only hope that they would bring with them some kegs, but remember, kegs are heavy because they're made out of wood. So with it, you've got a bunch of issues there. So it varied. Might run into 2-3 water sources in a day to many days in between, and the water might not be any good. Next.
Awesome. So if I could just kind of bringing it back to the relationship. Again, we're talking to Diana Ahmad. Success depends on the animals. If you guys have any questions or comments that you want addressed, now would be the time to put them in, because we're wrapping up. They go on this journey. What is the significance of the relationship between these animals and these humans by the time they get to their destination?
Many of them don't write their feelings, right? They didn't write their feelings. That took time at the end of the day. All right, so they didn't do that. But for the most part, you do have the extreme people who say that they did not want to be a slave owner selling their slave. Actually made reference to that. And of course, this is the era when the United States still had slavery. So they didn't want to sell their animal as if it was a slave. But they realized they couldn't make it. And many of them noted in their diaries, and of course, nobody writes a diary thinking anybody's ever going to read it. They comment that they cried. And these are not just the girls, right, who were crying, or the wives who were crying. These were men that wrote saying the tears rolled down their face as they sold their horse or their ox or their mule, that they could not have done it without. But they needed to sell the animal at the end because, okay, they've made it to California, they've made it to Oregon. Now you need to buy equipment for your new farm. You need to buy the washing pan so you can go gold mining. So you needed the money. So it was like a tool that you had. All right. But they did express feeling and often wept when they did have to get rid of their animals. But the price they got was a good one. You could buy a good horse, for example, for about $50 or $60 in Missouri, right? In St. Joe or Independence. And by the time you got to California, you could sell it for $200. So, I mean, you've paid $50, the animal's worn out, and you're still getting $200. So it shows that they're not that common yet, right? They're not that common. So it was in there. So, oh, by the way, I just remembered one of the other creatures with the dog. Remember the question that had the pigs and the chickens and the other things that went west? There is one pig that went west. They called him Mr. Pig. All right. They called him Mr. Pig, and Mr. Pig made it out west. We don't know what happened to him after he got to California, but he helped actually drive a train of cattle that went with some young men from Arkansas. Just remembered Mr. Pig.
Well, good for Mr. Pig. He's immortalized forever on the internet.
Absolutely. But otherwise, no, the humans valued them. And remember, not everybody's going to be, oh, I love my horse. You know, they're not going to be that way. All right. But some are more expressive than others.
Awesome. And just because somebody doesn't necessarily write it down in a diary doesn't mean that the feelings weren't felt. And
exactly. Exactly.
So it's a reflection, of a broader thing. Awesome. Well, thank you, Diana. And I'm wondering, so we've been talking about success depends on the animals, and I'm wondering if you can give us an idea. What do you hope a reader who picks this up at the library or who buys it, what do you hope that they're going to take away from this book?
That we don't give enough credit to the animals. When you watch like Wagon Train, from a long time ago, I mean, that's 50, 60 years old now, but Wagon Train had horses. It was mostly oxen that went west. But what I want somebody to take out of it, if there was one thing, is my book is the only book on animals on the Overland Trails. You get some of the best books on the trails going west. There will be 1 or 2 pages about the animals. They'll tell you how much an ox costs. They'll tell you that, oh, you should use a horse for this and a mule for that. But that's all they tell you. They don't tell you how much work the animals put forth going west and bringing the families west. So in that sense, without the animals, could we have gone west? Probably would have had to wait for the train. Now, the Canadians, they didn't fill in the inner parts of Canada, right? Toronto, they stop, and then all of a sudden it's on, British Columbia. In between, the Canadians waited for the Canadian government to build a train to go across. So who was smarter? The Canadians to wait to go across on the train, or the Americans who said, we're going to do this, and they go west? And by the way, just as an aside, because I just read, I was a reviewer for an article on this today. I'm not on mine, but on the Overland Trails. There were not that many problems with Native Americans. They were, a little fearful they'd steal their animals and things, but there's not that much trouble. It depends on the year and the time, but overall, not that much trouble. The Native Americans would sometimes try to steal your horses. They did not steal oxen, but they would try to steal your horses, because remember, the Native Americans hunted buffalo, and you're not going to hunt buffalo with an ox. It's not going to work. But ox sometimes did join a buffalo herd.
Interesting. And that kind of reminds me of a question I was meaning to ask you too. What's an animal that you would take on the journey? What's like your number one priority animal that you take on the journey?
The one I'd like to take is the beautiful horse. Not taking a mule. I would go with the oxen. And I would have, excuse me. Now, this is assuming I'm rich enough to buy all this, right? I would have my wagon. I would have 4 yoke of ox. So that's 8 ox. And then I would have 2 more wagons behind me that are not fully fledged wagons, but they would have, one would have the food for the animals, and the other would have the water for humans and animals. And there would be 6 ox for each one of those wagons. So I would have 6 oxen with the water, 6 oxen with the food, 8 oxen for the things that I'm bringing west to California or to Oregon. And the upside to that is it's making it easier for everybody because they can eat, they can drink. And then as the food goes away, right, as that one little wagon that has your grasses and so forth in it, as it disappears, well, then we unhitch the oxen and we let them walk without pulling anything. And then I would alternate them. So oxen number 1 through 8 will walk for 2 days, and then we replace them with number 9 through number 16. All right, we'd replace them and alternate them. But that's in the best of all worlds. All right, that would be the best of all worlds. They're not the prettiest. Nobody ever goes, oh, how beautiful is the ox? Well, I've read that like maybe twice. But otherwise, the most beautiful was the horse. The most aggravating was the mule, because mules did what mules wanted. But my choice would be the ox. It would take longer to get there. Horses, you could get there about 2 weeks faster than with ox. All right, so with the oxen, it would take me longer, but I'm probably pretty sure going to get to Oregon or California. So that's what I would do. I would take the ox.
Awesome. And we have a question. Did you do your dissertation on the animals on the Overland Trail?
No, I did a different part. Yeah, that's the book. My dissertation at the University of Missouri, Columbia, is now a book. It's called The Opium Debate and Chinese Exclusion Laws in the 19th Century American West. So I dealt with American opposition to the Chinese and demands to ban Chinese from entering the United States with the 1882 exclusion law. So how do I go from opium to animals? It's easy. It's all American Western history. It's also manifest destiny. So the belief that Americans rock. The definition of manifest destiny is very complicated. And in the news lately, they've been using it wrong. I scream at the TV nightly lately. So it's an idealistic concept. All right, idealistic. And do you know anything that's ideal? I don't think we've gotten to that point. Not in our societies anyway.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Terry.
And then she follows up. My grandfather and great aunt crossed the plains in a covered wagon in the early 1900s.
Wow, that's unusual. There are still some. Because by this time, of course, we have trains, right? 1869, the trains go across. But there are still some people who do go west. It may have something to do with money because you can bring things with you, right? Whereas on a train, you have to pay for every suitcase kind of deal. So it was there, but there are still some, not many, but there are some.
All right. My sister Jackie's on tonight, and she says an ox is a great choice. So she's with
Thank you. Is she Ms. Z?
Exactly, Ms. Z. Yeah, that's my sister. She also says the wagon train was really good. We were classic TV fans. So.
Oh, by the way, don't watch the Oregon Trail that's just on TV now.
It's bad, huh?
Oh my goodness. I watched the trailer and I couldn't get past the 30-second trailer. That's all I know is the trailer. It's like, oh my gosh, the mistakes.
I will have to tell you, I have seen some, as somebody who likes to read biographies, sometimes I'll go and I'll watch one of those dramas where they send it out by like 10 episodes, the person's life, and then I'll see something covered a certain way, and I'm like, woohoo, that was definitely dramatized. You think these people are watching, they're like, oh, that was how it was. Well, not really, but anyway, that's the joys of history. There's some myth that goes along with it. Awesome. Well, I think we got all the questions. We have lots of nice comments. Oh, you have a nice comment here. Great talk from my favorite professor, from Rebecca.
And my golden child.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank Diana. Do you have anything you want to say or cover before we close?
I'm just absolutely delighted that you asked me. I'm very excited to help celebrate the Rolla Public Library. You've got to get in and come to our library. It's awesome. Watch Mr. Z, as I call him. All right. And any of the other people who are presenting on our Rolla Library site, just go to facebook.com and type in Rolla Public Library. It's terrific. I think with that, it's just awesome. And celebrating Missouri's bicentennial. And our license plates say, but this makes it, I think, more real. Missouri was absolutely vital in the journey to the West. People don't stay here, because they're going west. They're looking for gold or whatever. But it was there, and we played a very vital role in that bicentennial and in that movement to the West.
Awesome. And just lots of thank yous coming in. Teresa says thank you. Terry says thank you. Amy, fun talk. Thank you, Amy. And then let's see. When I taught 4th grade Nebraska history, the Oregon Trail was my students' favorite computer game.
I died in the Dakotas. When I played it once. I died in South Dakota.
So that's that. That's a wrap. Thank you, Diana. Thank you for being here. I appreciate it. I love this book, by the way, and I think somebody has it checked out right now, but they're probably going to be returning it soon. So
because they had to return it.
so I put a hold on it if it's not here, and you'll get it soon. Or of course, you can get it on Amazon like I did. It's an awesome book. And if you study the American West or you have any kind of interest in how people travel or the relationship between animals and people, I know we have lots of pet owners here at the Rolla Public Library. Check out this book and read it. It's actually a pretty quick read. It's dense, it's well researched, but it's a quick read and you'll really enjoy it. So thank you, Diana, for being here, and thank you everybody for joining in tonight.
Thank you very much, everybody. Bye.
Bye, everybody.